Today is Monday, July 19th, and last night my wife and I were up late. We had a long talk because my wife gets upset about decisions our children make and just the challenges of parenting and the effects of children's behavior and things like that. And she likes to beat herself up sometimes, blaming herself for things or stressing out over things the children might do or say or choose. And she struggles with that stress of parenting. And she sees me, and I tend to be pretty calm and focused on my daily work and not stressed about those things. And so we were talking last night about why that is. And yet at the same time, she knows that I have very close relationships with my children. My children seek to please me and seek me out for advice, and there's this weird relationship between my children and I where even if they choose to not do what I tell them, they know what my will is, they know what my advice is, they seek my advice, and yet sometimes they choose to not do what I tell them, and I don't get upset about it. And my wife has a hard time understanding that relationship. She's more emotionally engaged than I tend to be. And so we had a talk last night to discuss, where I wanted to explain to her how I think about the children and my role as a parent, why I don't get stressed or upset about decisions that the children make, and why my relationship with the children is good, even though it's obvious that in different things the children might not agree with me, yet they still respect me and we have a loving relationship. It's a very strange dynamic. And so I sat down with my wife to explain how I think about parenting and how that affects my relationship with my children, and my overall disposition towards the work of parenting and life as a father. So what I started with, and I'm sharing this because I think it will be helpful for many families, because I think that the problem that my wife has with this is common. I think it's a problem that most Catholic parents have, especially mothers. And I think that I can provide some helpful discussion. I know it comforted my wife last night, and she was persuaded that I was right in what I was saying, and I think that it will have the same effect on other Catholic parents, and I hope that it does. What I told my wife was the reason why she gets anxious and stressed out and upset about parenting is because for her, she has no objective set of rules or standards by which she can judge whether or not she's doing her job. She judges how well she's doing as a mother by the results of what's happening in the lives of the children. And so this takes away from her, it takes away from her the ability to be successful and makes it dependent on how the children respond. If a child is acting well today, she feels like she's doing a good job, and if a parent is acting badly the next day, all of a sudden she's no longer a good parent and she's doing a bad job and she's stressed, and her judgment of her own parenting ability is not in her control, but she hands it over to the children, and their behavior becomes her judgment. And she lives in this constantly changing back and forth, uncertain, unstable world where the children's behavior judges her as a parent. And I told her, that's your problem and it's your fault. And I explained to her that for me, I know objectively what the duties of parents are. I know this objectively. I can make a list, a checklist of the duties of parents. And I can go through that checklist and I can assure you that every one of those boxes is checked. Now there's always room where I can improve. That's a different issue, but the boxes are all checked as far as what my duties are towards my children and whether or not I objectively fulfill those duties. When I fulfill my duties as a parent, what the children do in response to that or after that is their own personal business. They are independent human beings. They're not my creatures. They're not my property. They're going to make their own decisions in life, and those decisions are going to come with rewards and punishments. Their decisions will be paid for in their lives by those who make those decisions. And that life of free decision-making with the rewards and punishments that follow are what ultimately will teach that child what's right and wrong, who's right and wrong, and will guide their behavior over time. And I told my wife that the duties of parents are not a mystery. It's not like I have some profound wisdom that after all of my years of philosophical study, I've discovered the secrets of parenting. I told my wife the duties of parents are explained right in the Catechism. The Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches us explicitly what the duties of parents are. And if you study the Church's teaching on the duties of parents, you can turn around, examine yourself, and simply ask the question, am I fulfilling my duties as a parent, or am I neglecting my duties as a parent? And if you are fulfilling your duties as a parent, then you should have peace. And the decisions that your children make should be understood to be their decisions. And so we spent a while together. We pulled out a couple copies of the Catechism, and we went through the Church's teaching on the duties of parents, and I'd like to offer that same discussion with you in this talk today. So if you're a Catholic parent and you are concerned about your children, as you should be, and you want to know what your duties are toward your children, you can learn that in the Catechism. And as we read this, you can ask yourself, am I fulfilling these duties or not? And if you're not, you simply need to begin fulfilling them. And if you are, then you need to continue to fulfill them and try, with God's grace, to do so even better. But your children's choices and behavior in life, especially I'm talking about adult children, as children make their way through their teens and into adulthood, their decisions are not going to be in your control, nor are you accountable for them. And of course, I'll show you this as we look at the Catechism together. So if you're just listening to this, as I know some do while they work, or while mom is doing some chores in the house, she may be listening to this talk. I'll read the text for you so you don't have to go get a copy of the Catechism. And I'll tell you where these passages are, so if you do want to dig into it a little more carefully afterwards, you can easily do so. So let's go through what the Church teaches about the duties of parents to their children. Let me pull it up here on my phone. Okay, the duties of parents. So this is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, beginning at paragraph 2221. It's the section of the Catechism that discusses the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment is honor thy father and thy mother, and in its exposition or teaching of that commandment, the Church goes into detail and discusses what it means to honor thy father and thy mother. It talks about the duties of children, but it also teaches the duties of parents towards their children. This begins in paragraph 2221. And there we read, the fecundity or fruitfulness of conjugal love cannot be reduced solely to the procreation of children, but must extend to their moral education and their spiritual formation. In other words, this idea that large families are blessed is a lie. The fact that you can reproduce and make babies is not a sign that you're doing God's will. Because making babies is just the beginning of the fruit of conjugal or married love. That love of marriage doesn't end in the birth of a child, but continues in the education and spiritual formation of that child. And here the Church is laying the foundation for what will be explained as the duties of parents. Parents are responsible not only to produce children, but also to provide them with an education and spiritual formation. The role of parents in education, it goes on to say, is of such importance that it is almost impossible to provide an adequate substitute. In other words, if parents don't do their job, if parents don't fulfill their duties to educate and form their children, there's no alternative. The right and duty of parents to educate their children are primordial and inalienable. Primordial means that the right and duty of parents to educate their children is not based on some unique historical circumstance or some certain period of world history, but it goes back to the very origin of the human race and creation of the world. It's natural and human for parents to educate and form their children, and it's inalienable, meaning it's a right that no one can take away from parents. It's given to them by God and part of the very nature of human love and reproduction, the right to educate and form one's children. Paragraph 2222. Parents must regard their children as children of God and respect them as human persons. And this is where I feel Catholic parents often begin to run off the rails. Parents must regard their children as God's children, as children of God. In other words, our children are not our servants, they're not our playmates, they're not our property. When we give birth to a child, that's not now a life that's ours to do with what we want. That child lives to know, love, and serve God. That child is not born into the family as a servant or as a pet for us to play with, to entertain ourselves with. That child is to be understood by parents as an independent, individual child of God, and is to be respected as an individual, human person. Remember that when a child is born, and when our children are growing up in our house, they are imperfect in the sense that they are growing and they are becoming perfect. And when they reach adulthood and into their adult life, that's when their human nature is perfected and they live as adults, as individual persons before God. And our role in their lives is not to raise some personal member of our family who owes us a lifetime of service. The child in our home is not a part of our team. He's not obligated to work to promote our family or our family business or our family name. But he's an individual person. She is an individual person who's to be raised to live as a child of God. The relationship of parents to children is a temporary one in the sense that obedience to parents and a parent's right to command children is limited to childhood. And so the first challenge for parents is to ask themselves whether they think of their children rightly or whether they've embraced some perverted view of the relationship between parents and children. If they have some kind of selfish, worldly ambition to create some kind of great family, like they're living in Victorian England, which, remember, was not Catholic. No child has an obligation to promote the family name or fortune, or to keep the family farm, or any other temporal responsibility. Every child is born into the world as a child of God and as an individual human person. And parents need to make sure that they don't create expectations and pressures on their children that they have no right to impose upon them. And I believe in many families and for many parents, this is one of the causes of the stress in family life. Father looks at his sons as future employees or an heir to the family business, and the son has no obligation to take over the family business. Remember, It's a Wonderful Life with George Bailey, where the father dies and the business is just kind of dumped on George. Remember, that's Hollywood. That's not real life. George Bailey would have no obligation to continue his father's business. George Bailey's obligation in the real world would be to serve God in the best way possible with his life. Likewise, if you think of Pride and Prejudice, the mother in the Bennet family is concerned that her daughters marry well so that she is able to keep the house. All of the stress and pressure on the marrying of the daughters is at the service of the mother and her future condition. Whereas, as we'll see, a mother has no such right to put any such pressure on her children. Again, that's part of Protestant England. That's not Catholic culture. And so this could be one of the sources of stress in the lives of parents, their own ambitions and goals for their children, which they have no right to set on those children. Paragraph 2222. Parents must regard their children as children of God and respect them as human persons, showing themselves obedient to the will of the Father in heaven. They educate their children to fulfill God's law. They educate their children to fulfill God's law. And so what children should be raised to do is to grow up and serve God in the best way possible. And the parents do not have the right to prescribe what that way is, only to educate their children and teach them to fulfill God's law. And we'll look more into this in detail as we go on. So that's paragraph 2222. Paragraph 2223. Parents have the first responsibility for the education of their children. Parents have the first responsibility for the education of their children. They bear witness to this responsibility first, and pay attention here, they bear witness to this responsibility by creating a home in which or where tenderness, forgiveness, respect, fidelity, and disinterested service are the rule. So if you want to put something on the refrigerator, you can focus on these 5 qualities that should be present in a Catholic home. Tenderness, forgiveness, respect, fidelity, and disinterested service. And so as a parent, you can objectively examine yourself and ask, have I created a home where tenderness, forgiveness, respect, fidelity, and disinterested service are the rule? Now, as I said, when I examine myself and consider this and look at my home, I can say with a good conscience, yes, I have, as a father, created a home where tenderness, forgiveness, respect, fidelity, and disinterested service are the rule. I have objectively created such a home. Check that box. The home, it goes on to say, is well suited for education in the virtues. The home is well suited for education in the virtues. Now, one thing that I'd like to point out to you, that I pointed out to my wife last night, is that the duties of parents are largely limited to natural virtues. For example, you see that the Catechism did not say the duty of a father is to create a home where the children believe in God. It doesn't say that, because that's not possible. That's not within the power of any parent, to create a home where the children obey God, where the children love God, where the children hope in God. The church doesn't teach that as a duty of parents because it's not humanly possible. It's not in a parent's power to make his children believe, hope, and love God. That's something else. The rule of the home, look at the things that are included in the list. Tenderness, forgiveness, respect, fidelity, and disinterested service. These are natural virtues. Natural virtues. And the Catechism goes on to say, the home is well suited for education in the virtues. Now, we have to understand that the classical virtues are learned through education. Aristotle explains this in the Ethics. The supernatural virtues, however, faith, hope, and charity, are not gained through education. Faith, hope, and charity are supernatural virtues. They're infused into the soul by God. You cannot train a child to have faith. You cannot train a child to have hope. You cannot train a child to have charity. Faith, hope, and charity, the theological virtues, are infused by God into the soul. Parents cannot give their children the supernatural virtues, but parents can educate their children in the natural virtues. The home is well suited for education in the virtues. And these virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. The home is well suited for education in the classical or natural virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Children should be learning those virtues in the home. So when we look at a family and we see that a family has a bunch of obese children who are not being taught temperance, we see parents who are failing to fulfill the duties of parents, because the home is the place where children are educated in the virtues. Temperance is learned in the home. And I know that that may be painful to hear, but when we see a family where the parents themselves are not temperate, and they are raising children who are not temperate, there we see parents who are failing to fulfill the duties of parents. If we see parents who are not just, and they're raising their children to not practice justice, we see a family where the parents are not fulfilling the duties of parents. For example, if a father tells his daughter that it's okay for her to work at the local restaurant as a teenager to get paid under the table and not pay income taxes or not file income taxes, that father is not teaching the child to be just, and therefore he's failing to fulfill his parental duties. When a mother who depends on her husband for her needs doesn't give him the respect and obedience that he deserves as a matter of justice, she is not training her children in the virtues and is not fulfilling the duties of a parent. The home is well suited for education in the virtues, and when parents don't educate their children in the virtues, then they are failing to fulfill their duties, and they should be concerned. Again, in my life, I can objectively evaluate my household and ask, are my children being trained in prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance? And I can check those boxes and say, yes, they are. I can prove it. I can show you all the ways in which my children are being trained in those virtues. My children are living examples of these virtues. If you were to go and look at my 21-year-old son, while he may make decisions at this point in his life that are questionable, certainly that I would not personally agree with, at the same time we can look at him objectively and ask, has he been raised to be prudent? Yes, he has. Has he been raised to be just? Yes, he has. Has he been raised to be courageous? Yes, he is courageous. He's been raised to be courageous. And has he been raised to be temperate? Yes, he has been raised to be temperate. Many of these things we can measure by simply observing their lives. It's not a mystery. I can go to bed at night knowing that I have fulfilled this duty and am fulfilling this duty as a parent. So going on here. This requires an apprenticeship. So this is the nature of the work of parents. It's an apprenticeship. Parents teach their children through an apprenticeship. And what that means is they practice the faith themselves, and the children learn the Christian life. They learn this life of virtue not by being lectured by their parents, not by being sent to school to be told about this life, but they learn about this life by observing their parents who are living the virtuous life. This requires an apprenticeship in self-denial, sound judgment, and self-mastery. Self-denial, sound judgment, and self-mastery. So you can ask yourself, am I living a life that can be characterized by self-denial, sound judgment, and self-mastery? You have to, because it's your duty to apprentice your children in these virtues. It's your duty. Your children are supposed to learn them not by you giving them books to read, not by you having them watch saint movies, but they're supposed to learn them by living with you. They're supposed to be trained in them by participating in your life, where you live according to these virtues. Self-denial, sound judgment, and self-mastery, because these are the preconditions of all true freedom. Are you providing your children with an apprenticeship in self-denial, sound judgment, and self-mastery? These are objective standards, objective duties of parents. You should be able to assess objectively, not subjectively, but objectively, whether or not you're fulfilling the duties of parents. Parents should teach their children to subordinate the material and instinctual dimensions to interior and spiritual ones. In other words, parents should teach their children that the soul is more important than the body, and that material and exterior concerns in life should be subject to interior or spiritual ones. Are you doing that for your children? If your children look at your life, do they see a life? Do they see a life where material and instinctual dimensions are subjected to interior and spiritual ones? Or do they see a father who neglects any concern for his interior or spiritual life in the pursuit of an unbridled desire or concern for material and instinctual ones? In other words, do you live like a man or do you live like an animal? Parents have a grave responsibility to give good example to their children. By knowing how to acknowledge their own failings to their children, parents will be better able to guide and correct them. And so we see that the duty of parents does not require any kind of perfectionism. And part of being a good parent is setting an example, confessing your sins to your children, confessing your failures, constantly amending your life, and showing your children how that life works, how a life of sanctification works. Not perfection, but constant self-improvement, admitting our faults, confessing our sins, and constantly improving. Parents have a grave responsibility to give good example to their children. By knowing how to acknowledge their own failings, parents will be better able to guide and correct them. One of the reasons will be because children will trust parents who, when they do things wrong, acknowledge it and admit it, rather than make excuses for it or pretend no one saw it. If you lose your children's trust because they know that you're dishonest, it's game over for parenting. Paragraph 22-24. The home is the natural environment for initiating a human being into solidarity and communal responsibilities. Parents should teach children to avoid the compromising and degrading influences which threaten human society. In other words, behavior that's harmful to the community, harmful to the family, contrary to the common good. That behavior is learned in a family. That's the natural environment where concern for the common good is learned. Paragraph 22-25. Through the grace of the sacrament of marriage, parents receive the responsibility and privilege of evangelizing their children. Evangelizing their children, making disciples of their children. You have the responsibility to make disciples of your children. The church explains, parents should initiate their children at an early age into the mysteries of the faith, of which they are the first heralds for their children. They should associate them from their tenderest years with the life of the church. Our duty is to evangelize our children. We're to make them disciples. We are not evangelicals or Protestants who believe that we're saved by grace through faith alone. We believe that we're saved through the church. And God calls us to membership and participation and obedience to the church. And therefore, evangelizing our children includes teaching our children the gospel or the good news of salvation, but it also includes initiating them from their tenderest years, it says, into the life of the church. This begins, of course, with infant baptism. So here's one of your duties as a parent. When you gave birth to your child, did you bring that child to the church and through the sacrament of baptism initiate him into the life of the church? Yes or no? This is another one of these duties where I can check the box and say, yes, of course we did that. Once the child begins to grow in the church, you know the church has a whole system of faith formation and sacramental preparation. Do you participate in that faith formation and sacramental preparation? Do you prepare your child for the reception of First Communion and First Reconciliation? Does your child go through that process at the appropriate time, at age 7 or 8? Are you doing that? This is another duty where I can look at my children and say, yes, that duty has been fulfilled. My children have all been prepared and received by their pastor as being properly prepared and disposed for the reception of the sacraments. Every one of my children has received First Communion at the appropriate time. They've all been approved by our pastors for the sacramental life. Check that box. That's objective. Of course they've been prepared. I can prove it. The next step would be confirmation. Are there requirements in the church for confirmation? Is there education that's required for confirmation? Is there community service and parish service required for confirmation? Yes. Have my children been led and prepared for the reception of confirmation? Yes, they have. Has the church approved of my work in preparing my children to receive the sacrament of confirmation? Yes. Our bishop has established the standards and rules that qualify a child to be confirmed by the Catholic Church, and my children have been approved and confirmed by the Church. That's objective confirmation that I have fulfilled my duties as a Catholic parent. And I have taught my children the faith. I have raised a child whose behavior is considered respectable and obedient by the Church. And I've prepared them to be approved and confirmed by a bishop in the Church. Yes, I can check that box. I have initiated my children into the faith. I have evangelized my children. I have provided them with Christian education. That's another objective duty. Paragraph 2225, to finish up that paragraph. A wholesome family life can foster interior dispositions that are a genuine preparation for a living faith and remain a support for it throughout one's life. Now, it does not say that a wholesome family life can infuse into the soul a living faith. That's not what it says, because that's not possible. It says a wholesome family life can foster interior dispositions that prepare for a living faith and remain as a support for a living faith throughout one's entire life. So what this teaches us is that while a parent cannot make their child a believer, a parent cannot put faith in the soul of a child, cannot cause a child to hope in God or to love God. What parents can do is foster interior dispositions which prepare the soul for faith and support the soul in faith throughout its life. Preparation and support for life. So we can ask, is your family life preparing the interior disposition of your children to receive the graces of faith, hope, and charity? That's an objective measure. Does your family life support a life of faith? If God were to give your children faith, would your family life support that life in your children? That's an objective measure. Yes, I can say confidently that my family life, living with me in my home as a child, supports and fosters the interior dispositions that prepare the soul for faith. And I can also say that if God gives one of my children faith, my family life will support that life in my children. Absolutely. I can check that box and say, I have fulfilled that duty of parents. Paragraph 2226. Education in the faith by the parents should begin in the child's earliest years. This already happens when family members help one another to grow in faith by the witness of a Christian life in keeping with the gospel. Family catechesis precedes, accompanies, and enriches other forms of instruction in the faith. Parents have the mission of teaching their children to pray and to discover their vocation as children of God. More objective duties. Do you catechize your children? Do you catechize your children? This is an objective, measurable duty. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we teach children the Baltimore Catechism. I can say objectively, yes, my wife and I catechize our children. That is an objective, measurable duty that we fulfill. Do you teach your children to pray? Notice it does not say, do you cause your children to pray on their own? Or do you cause your children to love prayer? It doesn't say that. It says, do you teach your children to pray? That's an objective, measurable duty of parents. In other words, if your child decided one day that he wanted to pray, would he know how to? Has he been taught how to pray? The disciples in the gospel asked Jesus, Lord, teach us to pray. Did Jesus teach them how to pray? Yes, he did. Did Jesus make them pray? No, Jesus did not make them pray, but he taught them how to pray. Do your children know how to pray? Have you taught your children how to pray? This is a simple, objective, yes or no question. Can you check that box? Have you taught your children to pray? And again, it does not say, hey, Mrs. Smith, do your children pray on their own? That's not your duty as a parent. Your duty as a parent is to teach them how to pray. Have you taught your children to discover their vocation as children of God? Have you taught your children how to seek to know God's will in their life? Have you taught your children that their obligation in life is simply to know and do God's will in their life? Do they understand what the common options are for different vocations in life? Do they know what their options are? Have you explained to them what the options are? Or are they going into an adult world like a blind person running off a cliff in the darkness? Have you taught them what the common vocations are? Do they know what their options are? This is another objective duty of parents. You have either fulfilled this or not. There's no mystery, nothing to be confused or anxious about, and within your power. It goes on to say the parish is the Eucharistic community and the heart of liturgical life of Christian families. It is a privileged place for the catechesis of children and parents. Are you engaged in your parish? Or are you at home inventing your own religion, living as some kind of like radio religion family or internet Christian family? Is the parish the Eucharistic community and heart of your family's liturgical life? Again, this is a yes or no question. 22:27. Children in turn contribute to the growth and holiness of their parents. Each and every one should be generous and tireless in forgiving one another for offenses, quarrels, injustices, and neglect. Mutual affection suggests this. The charity of Christ demands this. When your children do things wrong, do they know that they can ask forgiveness and that you will give them that forgiveness? Do you forgive your children for wrongs that they do? Or do you hold grudges Do you make fun of them for mistakes they made in the past? Do you bring things up about the past to embarrass them? Or is the culture in your family forgiving? This is another objective, measurable duty of parents. And I can say, yes, my children know that I never hold them accountable for past sins. I treat them as if they never happened. We don't talk about them. We don't joke about them. What's past is past. What's forgiven is forgiven. And we live as if those things which were confessed were never done. Because that's what it means to forgive. 22:28. Parents' respect and affection are expressed by the care and attention they devote to bringing up their young children and providing for their physical and spiritual needs. As the children grow up, the same respect and devotion lead parents to educate them in the right use of their reason and freedom. So very simply, are you providing for the physical and spiritual needs of your children? That presupposes another question, which is, do you even know what are the physical needs and spiritual needs of your children? Are you providing the physical needs of your children? Are you providing the spiritual needs of your children? Very simple, objective question with a yes or no answer. Are you educating them in the right use of their reason and freedom? Are you educating your children in the use of freedom? This is the art of reasoning. Does the education you provide your children with emphasize and teach them the actual art and science of reasoning? Or do you leave them to sloppy, opinionated, and unreasonable thoughts? Are you providing your children with education in the right use of reason and in the right use of freedom? And again, this goes back to that idea of apprenticeship in virtue. Are you a model of right reason and of the right use of personal freedom? 22:29. As those first responsible for the education of their children, parents have the right to choose a school for them which corresponds to their own convictions. Parents have the right to choose a school for their children which corresponds to their own, that is, the parents' convictions. Now, I know Catholic parents that send their children to public schools. Can it possibly be true that a public school is a school that corresponds to their own convictions as Catholics? Parents have the right and duty to choose a school that corresponds to their convictions. Now, if a parent chooses a school for a child because of the tuition of that school, that's obviously not what it means to choose a school that corresponds to the convictions of a parent. Likewise, if a parent chooses a school that's expensive because it offers hope of some kind of college admission or some successful future, and yet that school does not correspond to the convictions of the parent as regards his or her professed Catholic faith, neither of those parents, the one choosing the free public school nor the one choosing the expensive private school, is fulfilling the duty of a parent as regards the education of their children. If there is no school in the area that offers an education that corresponds to the parents' convictions, then the parents remain responsible for the education of that child, and that's why homeschooling exists and is legal. Homeschooling is a protection of the rights of parents to educate their children according to their own convictions. And if there's no school available that corresponds to parents' convictions as Catholic adults, then they must homeschool their children and provide that education. They can't just say, oh well, no good Catholic schools around here, guess you're going to the public school, bub. That's a neglect of parents' duties. That's a neglect of duties. Remember before. Now let's say the parents have excuses. Oh, I have to work. Oh, I have this, I have that. Remember before we said that this is supposed to be an apprenticeship in virtue? Remember before that we said that parents are to lead their children and set a good example of what it means to subject material and instinctual dimensions to interior and spiritual ones? Well, don't you think that education is a prime opportunity for parents to do that? And can you imagine a child being told by his parents that they have decided to send him to public school because they're not going to be able to keep this fancy house that they like unless mommy goes to work. And since mommy has to go to work to keep this fancy house and this extra car, they're going to have to send the child to a school that does not teach the Catholic faith. What a good example that is. Isn't that such a good example of how to live the Catholic life? How to subject material and instinctual dimensions of life to internal and spiritual dimensions? Isn't that such a good example? Showing the children exactly the opposite of what they should do in life? If that's what you do, then you should be concerned for your children. Because it's your duty as their parents to provide for their education and spiritual formation. It's your duty as parents to provide for their education and spiritual formation. It's not the church's duty to educate your children. It's not the state's duty to educate your children. It's your duty to educate your children. And if there's no school that can educate your children according to your stated convictions, it's your job to provide that education. And in 2021, you have no excuse. Homeschooling is extremely affordable and convenient. You have no excuse. And if you say, well, we can't do it because we have to work, what are you teaching your children? Maybe you should stop going to church on Sunday too, because you could work extra and maybe afford a new pool in the backyard. Maybe you could get a third car. Maybe you can add a vacation. If you would just cut out church on Sunday, after you've already cut out Christian education, you can just keep going and cut out church. You can cut out family prayer. You can cut out everything religious and just justify it by saying, oh, well, if we don't work on Sunday, well, then we can actually both take part-time jobs and work on the weekend, and that can give us more money, and we can get more stuff. Yeah, just keep going. Keep going. This directly applies to the duties of parents toward their children. And notice what it says, duties of parents. This is not extra credit work. This is not charity work. This is the duty of parents. To provide an education that corresponds to their convictions. And we read here that as far as possible, parents have the duty of choosing schools that will best help them in their task as Christian educators. Public authorities have the duty of guaranteeing this parental right and of ensuring the concrete conditions for its exercise. In America, nobody can complain about that because our state most certainly does protect a parent's right to educate their own children. Paragraph 2230. When children become adults, and this is very important, because we have parents who look at someone like Saint Monica, and they look at Monica's anxiety for her son, Augustine, and many mothers torment themselves because of the adult choices made by their children. Listen to this carefully. When children become adults, children have the right and duty to choose their profession and state of life. When children become adults, they have the right and duty to choose their profession and their state of life. In other words, mom and dad, that's none of your business. Children have the right and duty to choose their own profession and state of life. You have no right to tell them that they need to get married. You have no right to tell them that they should be a monk or a nun or a priest. You have no right to pressure them in these decisions. They're none of your business. They're between the child and God alone. They should assume their new responsibilities with a trusting relationship with their parents, willingly asking and receiving their advice and counsel. Parents should be careful not to exert pressure on their children, either in the choice of a profession or in the choice of a spouse. Parents should be careful not to exert pressure on their children, either in the choice of a profession or in that of a spouse. How much parental anxiety comes from parents who are trying to exert pressure on their children to choose a certain profession, or to choose a certain state of life, or to choose a certain spouse. How many parents inflict that anxiety and stress upon themselves because they're meddling in decisions in their adult children's lives that are not their business? If your anxiety comes from feeling that it's your job to make your child make the quote-unquote right decision, you're wrong. You do not have the authority as a parent to pressure your children into any decisions about their profession, about their state of life, or about their marriage partner. That's their decision. This necessary restraint, parents that is, restraining themselves and staying in their place, this restraint does not prevent parents from giving their children judicious advice, particularly when they are planning to start a family. So parents are certainly to be available as advisors to their children, but they are not to be nagging, interfering, tests to their children, pressuring their choices. They're not to be sitting around the house with their own heart and mind all wrapped up in their children's adult affairs. They're to mind their own business. And in all reality, if the parents have proven themselves through the years by their example to be wise or prudent and just and courageous and temperate, of sound judgment, self-disciplined, with self-mastery, if the parents, through the years of raising their children, actually have been a good example of everything that they're supposed to be, it'll be natural for children to seek their parents' advice. But if the parents have been hypocritical, if the parents are an embarrassment to the children because of their own vices, many of which are visible and embarrassing, if the parents have been nags, if the parents have been hypocritical, constantly fault-finding, if they're cynical, if they're critical, if they make fun of their children's faults and weaknesses, that's one of the reasons why children don't ask their parents for advice. And as I said before, my children come to me for advice. They don't necessarily agree with me. I don't exert any pressure on them. In fact, I often push them away when they ask for advice, and I say things like, "You're not going to listen to me anyway." And they'll come back and say, "No, seriously, what do you think I should do?" I even go so far as to push back a little and make sure that they really do want to hear my advice. And when I tell them, I make it very clear. Honestly, I don't care what you choose to do. I'm not interested in arguing about it. I'm not interested in debating with you. But this is my advice, and I make it very explicit and very clear what I think that they should do in a certain situation, and that's the last I say of it. They seek my advice. I tell them. I kind of push back a little bit. I make sure that they ask me a second time for my advice, and then I preface my advice by saying, I don't care whether you follow my advice or not. This is my advice, and I speak to them crystal clear without any compromise. I don't try to figure out a way to wiggle, them into my position. I don't try to figure out a way to cause them to do something. I don't put any pressure on them. I don't try to sell them. I simply state in crystal clear language what I would do or what I think they should do, and that's the end of the discussion. If one of my adult children chooses to do something on their own, they will preface it when they talk to me and say, "Dad, I already know what you think about this." And as soon as I hear that, I know my duty's done as a father. If my children do something I don't agree with, they themselves will preface it with, "I know what you think about this. I know you don't agree with me about this, but hey, you know what? That's fine. You've just testified that I've done my duty as a father. I've offered my advice, and you chose, as an adult, to do something else. I'm not responsible for that decision. I'm not going to pressure you to make decisions according to my will, because that's not my role or my duty as a father." And yet my children know what I think, and when they do things, when they make decisions contrary to my advice, they know that they're acting contrary to my advice. And when their decisions go wrong, they can look back and say, "Dang it, Dad told me not to do that." And that will affect the next time that we have a discussion and they ask me for advice. Because the second time that they ask for advice, not only will I have my advice to give them, but in their own minds, they'll have the memory of my previous right advice, and my advice will become more and more persuasive by their own experience. And that's what I desire. I tell them, you can do whatever you want. It's your life. And I'll tell my kids things like, go ahead, do whatever you want. And when I say that, my children often get afraid. Even if they want to disagree with me, even if they don't want to do what I say, when they feel me hand them over to their own decisions, they get worried. And they'll usually come back to me and say, no, seriously, Dad, what do you think I should do? But I make it very clear that their decisions as adults are their own decisions. They're very serious decisions. They are not my decisions. I am not responsible for the consequences of those decisions. And when those decisions do have consequences, it's going to be their business in their independence to deal with those consequences. And the kids learn pretty quickly when they're given that freedom by their parents. They learn pretty quickly that bad decisions have serious consequences, and the costs can add up very quickly in life. And it doesn't take long for them to learn, especially when they've seen in their own experience that their father's advice was right. That he predicted exactly what was going to happen. He already knew what would happen. He told them what would happen. They chose not to take that advice, and exactly what Dad said would happen, happened, and that changes the discussion the next time those kids come for advice. And the father's advice, if it's actually good advice, becomes more and more weighty and influential in their life. The parents should not exert pressure. We want our children to learn these lessons by experience. Of course, we want to be there as sort of a safety net because we don't want our children to be hurt or destroyed by something. But at the same time, we do want them to learn as early as possible that there are consequences for their decisions and that they're going to have to pay for the decisions that they make. It's like on a farm. We put up an electric fence and we want the animals to get shocked. We want them to learn where the boundaries are. We want them to rub their nose on that electric fence, and we want them to feel the pain of that shock. We know that shock's not deadly, it's not dangerous, but it's painful. And the sooner they learn that, the better. And it's good for our children to stretch their wings a little bit, try to stand on their own feet, make their own decisions. God willing, they'll make good decisions. And remember, good decisions don't mean that they do whatever their parents say, because your kids may be wiser and better than you. My kids have gone on to do things in their early adulthood that are already beyond where I was at their age. They've done things differently than I would have done them. And I want to be careful that God doesn't actually lead my children to be wiser and better than me, and I quench it by trying to make them do what I would do or do what I say. It's very possible that God is more gracious than we expect and may be leading our children to be better and wiser than we are. So we need to be careful. But we shouldn't exert pressure on our children. We shouldn't seek to bail them out of every mistake. That's one of the ways in which we can spoil children. If they make a decision and it comes with some consequences, they need to be made to pay for those consequences, because that's what's going to help them mature and start sobering up as young adults and avoid making those decisions because they know it's no joke. First speeding ticket teaches a good lesson. First time you run your mouth off in public and you're not surrounded by a bunch of Christians and you're faced with a guy who might punch you right in the face, you learn real quick that you need to discipline yourself, live with sound judgment, and practice self-mastery. And kids need to learn those lessons. 22:31. Some forego marriage in order to care for their parents or brothers or sisters. Marriage, unlike in Protestant circles, marriage is not to be taught to our children as sort of the ultimate end or the highest calling of the Christian life. Marriage is not even necessary. One can choose to live a religious life and never marry, but as the church teaches here, one can choose to simply not marry for some other purpose. Some forego marriage in order to care for their parents or brothers and sisters, or to give themselves more completely to a profession, or to serve other honorable ends. They can contribute greatly to the good of the human family. And that's the end of this section on the duties of parents. So my point in sharing all this is that you as a parent have to understand rightly what your duties actually are. Because if you don't understand your duties rightly, you can act in ways that actually undermine the role that you're supposed to play in your children's lives. You can act in a way that actually frustrates or limits God's plans for your children's lives. You can basically make yourself the box which is going to contain your children, which is not God's will. You're not the limit of human ability. You're not the limit of God's will in the world. And how do you know that God isn't actually leading your children to greater things, things that you dream about for your children, but you're in the way because of your own weaknesses, your own anxieties, your own excessive concerns? Consider whether God may actually be more generous to your children than you imagine, and may be leading them to do things that are even greater than what you hope for. Stay in your lane as a parent. Understand what your duties are and concentrate all of your time and energy to fulfilling those duties. Because many parents are not fulfilling those duties and are doing things that are none of their business, or are doing things that actually contradict the duties of parents, like making bad decisions about education. And yet they'll give their children a hard time about adult decisions which are none of their business, while they neglect the things that are their business. Don't do that. Starting in paragraph 22-21 of the Catechism, study these paragraphs and know what your duties are as parents. If you know them, you can fulfill them. And you can sit on the couch at night with a glass of wine, knowing that your duties as a parent are presently fulfilled. And this is what my wife and I talked about last night, because I live with that peace. And I'm not boasting as if it's some sort of extraordinary achievement, but the duties of parents are within our reach. It's not extraordinary. I can sit down at night and know that as a father, I am fulfilling my duties to my children. My wife has not been able to do that. She does not have that peace. She's always full of anxieties. And those anxieties and that stress that she struggles with is a fault that can be easily remedied. So last night we sat down and we went through all of these paragraphs together, and we just discussed what our actual duties are as parents. And as we went through these paragraphs, my wife could see areas where she misunderstood or was confused or was seeking to do things that actually weren't her business. And she told me at the end of this discussion that this is very comforting. And I told her, it's all right there in the catechism. This isn't some secret wisdom I have. My peace and calm as a father is not because I have some kind of miraculous grace. It's because I study the catechism. I know objectively what my duties are as a father. I fulfill those duties. And I have peace. And I can rest knowing that my duty is fulfilled. And when my children begin making adult decisions, or even as children, if they make decisions that are wrong, I can keep separate my duties and my decisions from their decisions. And I am not responsible for their decisions. This is something that Catholics do wrongly, is that they judge other parents based on what their children are doing, as if it's some kind of reflection on the parents, which is just false. You can have Catholic parents that are perfectly good parents who have a 21-year-old son that simply is making bad decisions at a certain point in his life. It has nothing to do with the parents. They may be telling him all the right things to do. They may have done the right things themselves. He may know perfectly well that he's doing the opposite of what his parents told him to do. It's got nothing to do with the parents necessarily. In the same way, you can see a child who's doing everything good. And it's not necessarily just to credit that to his parents, because his parents may actually be morally inferior to him. And he may be making good adult choices by grace given to him, and he's the one who deserves the credit for his good life, for his good decisions. And we have to learn to give credit to whom credit is due. Credit for adult decisions in life are owed to the adults themselves. And blame for bad decisions in adult life are owed to those who make those decisions themselves. The duties of parents are knowable, they're objective, they're measurable. And as parents, you need to make sure you understand the duties accurately so that you can have peace when you fulfill them. You can also make sure that you fulfill them and know that they're your duty. This isn't extra credit work. This isn't charity work. You're not doing anyone a favor by fulfilling the duties of parents to their children. It's your duty, and you're going to be held accountable for it. And at the same time, you can avoid unnecessary anxiety, worry, stress, despair by not putting on your shoulders the responsibility for the adult decisions of your children. And that's very important. Because when your children, or if your children make bad decisions, and they likely will, the devil will attempt, being a false accuser as he is, he will attempt to blame you and tempt you into all kinds of errors and bad decisions by misleading you and making you to feel guilty for decisions that are not your responsibility. And you have to be able to resist those temptations and refute them with the truth. You'll also face this kind of pressure from other people. If your children make bad decisions, you'll get accused by Satan's buddies all around you, other parents who gossip about you and say nasty things about you, all falsely. And you'll need to be able, in your own heart, to assure yourself that the things that they say are not true. And the only way you can do that is by making sure that they actually are not true. But you have to know the duties of parents. You have to work with all your might to fulfill them all. And you also have to know where the limits of parents' duties are, so you don't bring upon yourself vexation, frustration, anxiety, stress, worry, despair, anger. You don't ruin your relationships with your children because you are actually out of order. Many of the problems families have are caused by these things. So, go back and study the duties of parents and make sure you know what your duties are. Make sure you stay in your lane. And remember, those things that are not in your control, like your children's faith, hope, and charity, supernatural virtues, those things that are not in your control are the things that you should be praying for your children. That God would give your children faith, that God would give your children hope, that God would give your children charity and contrition. You have the acts of faith, hope, charity, and contrition to pray. Pray them with your children. Teach your children to pray those prayers and encourage your children to pray the act of faith, the act of hope, the act of love, the act of contrition. Teach your children to pray. That's one of your duties. But understand what they're supposed to be praying for. They're praying for grace. They're praying for God to give them the theological virtues which are the foundation and source of the Christian life. And you're supposed to be educating and training your children through an apprenticeship in virtue in the natural virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. All of these things are in your catechism. Take time to study it and put them into practice. If you'd like to discuss these things, if you'd like to ask questions and get into this a little more together, comment on the video or podcast, send me an email. I'd be happy to talk about these things with you, but I hope that's a helpful meditation. Remember, paragraphs 22, 21, and following in the Catechism. Study the duties of parents. Work to fulfill them. Constantly work to fulfill them. Work to keep fulfilling them. If you've failed in these duties, one of your duties is to go to your children and confess that you've failed. Apologize to them and show them that you're going to do something about it and amend your life. Show them that you're an honest Christian who can acknowledge his faults, who can confess his faults, and who is willing to amend his life. Apprentice your children in virtue. Show them how to live. You can't make them live well, but you can show them how to live. So that if and when they do desire to live well, they'll have your example in their mind as a guide to imitate. I hope that's a helpful meditation. As I said, if you'd like to talk about any of these things, please get in touch. God bless.